Elizabeth Báthory was born into one of the most powerful noble families in Europe. Her bloodline was ancient, wealthy, and untouchable, stretching across Hungary and Transylvania, connected to princes, generals, and rulers who shaped the region from the shadows from the moment she entered. The world Elizabeth lived above suspicion, because suspicion did not survive near her name. She grew up surrounded by luxury, education, and authority, but also by constant violence. Public executions, or common spectacles punishments, were cruel and deliberate, and fear was an accepted tool of order in 16th century society. She learned early that pain was not hidden, but normalized, and that power meant the freedom to act without consequence. Elizabeth was unusually educated for a woman of her time. She read and wrote fluently, spoke several languages, and managed complex estates with discipline and intelligence. This education did not soften her, it sharpened her sense of control. After marrying Count Ferenc, a feared military commander known across Europe for his brutality against enemies, she gained even greater independence while he was away at war. She ruled the household, alone, making decisions over land, money, and people without oversight. Servants arrived constantly, mostly young girls sent by poor families seeking protection or opportunity. They entered the castle and vanished from record when some failed to return home. Their absence was ignored because poor lives left no trace, and powerful names erased questions. Whispers spread quietly among villagers, stories of screams at night, of punishments that went too far. But no one dared accuse a woman whose family outranked courts and clergy. Elizabeth Báthory was not initially feared. She was respected, admired, even praised as a capable noblewoman, and that respect formed the shield behind which darkness could grow unchecked behind stone walls and locked doors. Because in a world ruled by hierarchy, wealth and blood power was not only protection, it was permission. And when power becomes absolute, suspicion disappears first and silence follows. Lactis Castle stood isolated on a hill, far from large cities, surrounded by forests and silence, a place where authority was absolute and no outside eyes lingered long inside its stone walls. Life followed rules that no one dared question. Young girls arrived regularly, sent by poor families, promised work, safety, and shelter. Many entered the castle and were never seen again. At first their absence was explained away: sickness, travel, punishment. But over time whispers grew louder. Villagers spoke of screams heard at night, echoing through the stone corridors, sounds of crying, begging, and pain that carried across the hills. Servants who remained began to show signs of fear and exhaustion, their bodies marked by bruises, burns, and wounds. They avoided eye contact, spoke little, and disappeared, suddenly replaced without explanation. Some tried to flee, but few succeeded. Those who did carried stories too terrifying to repeat openly: tales of locked rooms, brutal punishments, and a mistress who watched suffering without mercy inside the castle. Fear became routine. Discipline turned into cruelty, and cruelty into ritual. Punishment was no longer correction, it was control. Screams were meant to be heard, meant to remind everyone who held power. Guards and accomplices enforced silence, knowing their survival depended on obedience. The castle itself became part of the horror, its walls absorbing sound, its doors hiding truth, its isolation protecting everything that happened inside. The outside world continued unaware or unwilling to know. And as rumors spread beyond the forests, the name Elizabeth Báthory still silenced accusation, because when terror is protected by power, even screams are not enough to bring justice. What happened inside the castle was hidden from the world, but not from those forced to endure it behind closed doors. Punishment was constant, unpredictable, and absolute. Young servants were disciplined not for mistakes, but for existence itself. Rules changed without warning, and fear became the only certainty. Witnesses later described a pattern of systematic cruelty, where suffering was used to assert control. Humiliation, pain, and exhaustion replaced any notion of order. Elizabeth Báthory did not act in sudden rage, but with deliberate repetition, turning punishment into routine, and routine into terror. Methods varied, but the intent remained the same: to break bodies and wills alike. Servants were isolated, deprived of rest, exposed to cold hunger and relentless abuse until resistance disappeared. Those who survived bore marks that could not be hidden, and those who did not simply vanished, their names erased as if they had never existed. Accomplices participated out of fear, loyalty, or reward, enforcing silence and obedience, because disobedience meant joining the victims. The castle became a closed system where power flowed in one direction and suffering had no witnesses. Cruelty was not an accident. It was the mechanism by which control was maintained, and behind those walls violence was no longer shocking. It was normal, and when horror becomes normal, it no longer needs secrecy, it only needs silence. As the cruelty continued, the stories surrounding Elizabeth Báthory began to change, taking on a darker, more symbolic form. Whispers no longer spoke only of punishment, but of obsession, of a noblewoman terrified of aging, of losing beauty, power, and control in a world where youth meant value and decay meant weakness. According to later testimonies and legends, Elizabeth became convinced that blood held strength, that it preserved vitality, that it could stop time itself. Whether this belief was delusion, manipulation, or myth born from fear is still debated, but the idea spread rapidly. Servants spoke of rituals carried out in secret, of suffering transformed into purpose. Blood no longer represented pain alone, but renewal, control, and domination. The line between discipline and fixation disappeared, and the castle became a place where youth was consumed and age was feared. Elizabeth's obsession reflected something deeper than vanity. It was the terror of losing authority in a society that tolerated cruelty only while power remained. Intact beauty became another form of control, and blood another symbol of dominance, even as legends exaggerated reality. The core truth remained a woman using fear, pain, and belief to sustain absolute power, and whether the infamous bloodbaths truly occurred or were later embellishments, the myth endured because it fit the horror already known. When violence becomes routine, the mind seeks meaning, and obsession fills the void, turning cruelty into ritual and memory into legend. Silence protected Elizabeth Báthory for years, but silence does not last forever, as rumors spread beyond villages and reached members of the lower nobility and clergy. Concern replaced fear. Disappearances could no longer be ignored. When girls from lesser noble families began to vanish, questions became unavoidable. Pressure mounted quietly until an official investigation was ordered. Witnesses were gathered, testimonies recorded, and servants finally spoke, describing years of abuse, disappearances, and terror inside the castle. Raids uncovered imprisoned victims and evidence of systematic cruelty. Accomplices were arrested and interrogated. Some confessed. Others were executed quickly to contain the scandal. Elizabeth herself was never placed on public trial, not because evidence was lacking, but because her bloodline was too powerful to disgrace openly. Instead, a compromise was reached. Justice without spectacle. She was confined to her chambers, sealed away from the world. Walls built around doors, windows blocked, guards posted permanently. She lived imprisoned within her own castle, cut off from power, influence, and victims. The investigation exposed enough to end the horror, but not enough to satisfy truth. Elizabeth Báthory was erased from public life, but not declared innocent and not punished like those beneath her rank. The law bent once again, proving that power could still shape justice even in defeat. After her death, Elizabeth Báthory did not disappear. She transformed. History could no longer judge her in a courtroom, so it judged her through memory, rumor, and fear. Over time, her story grew darker, sharper, more monstrous. Some accounts painted her as the most prolific female killer in history. Others questioned the scale of the crimes, suggesting exaggeration, political motives, or convenient scapegoating. In a world where powerful women were dangerous, whether every legend is true or not, the evidence of abuse, terror, and death remains undeniable. Testimonies, documents, and confessions confirm a pattern of cruelty that cannot be erased. Yet the myth expanded because it needed to, because society struggles to understand horror without turning it into something inhuman, calling Elizabeth a Monster makes the story easier. It creates distance. It allows us to believe that such evil is rare, isolated, unnatural. But the truth is more disturbing. She was human, protected by status, enabled by silence, and empowered by a system that valued blood and rank over life. Elizabeth Báthory stands at the intersection of reality and legend, a figure shaped by both what she did and what people needed her to represent, and that is why her story endures, not because of blood alone, but because it exposes how easily fear becomes myth, how power delays justice, and how horror can grow quietly behind walls while the world looks away. Whether monster, myth, or scapegoat, one truth remains: her story is a warning. Not about monsters, but about what happens when power is absolute and no one dares to question it.